This is Jesse Gagushis, and I have interviewed my mother, Joy Gagushis. She was a first generation immigrant, and her mother was still quite mocked for having an accent in town. She wasn't particularly nurtured by her mother. She did have a great relationship with her father, but she spent a lot less time with him. The environment she grew up in was a little rough in that it was a very isolated, mile-long town where it really mattered to people if you were Catholic or you were Protestant and where you were from. Joy was in the middle because she was half Protestant and half Catholic. Each parent was the other thing. So she wasn't accepted anywhere, and both sides of her family were quite mean to her. There's a lot of racism and oppression during that time, and she always knew that she was being watched as to if she was seen with a Catholic, it would get back to her family and she would be in trouble. She wasn't allowed to associate or date Catholics. I'm looking at the early adulthood stage 6, 18 to late 20s. She moved out of the house and put herself through school and got herself a job and got married at 22 and really started making her footprint in the world in terms of figuring out what her ideas and beliefs actually were without the value system of her parents being forced on her. She had a significant experience with a rival who had a tragedy occur in her family when they were at school, and my mother just went into her room without really thinking about it and packed her things up for her so that she would be ready to go when her ride got there, because she was particularly emotional and not really functioning. And this person was gobsmacked that Joy would do a nice thing for her after she had been so nasty to her. And in hindsight, this was a growing experience for Joy in that she gained some confidence from knowing that she had the capacity to be that kind. Early adulthood was quite empowering, as it was the first time she had gotten out of town. She was still in a small town, but she wasn't nearly as isolated anymore. She was very social and had many dates and was able to associate with anyone she wanted for the first time. She became extremely loving and tolerant and believed everyone was equal. She did have some lingering shame due to the way that she grew up, however, and that would be a long-term struggle for her, but it is beginning to turn around during this stage for her. Education wasn't valued in her family, so she had no help as far as college. She put herself through school, and she was actually the first person to go to college as well as graduate in her family. She was still in the coal region, and there was still a lot of sexism happening, but it was an improvement to where she had grown up. She had a lot of successes at this time. It took a lot of courage for her to do what she did as a woman at that time. She began to develop self-worth for the first time during this period, and she got her degree and was hired at a nursery school, which she really loved. The crisis for Joy in her early adulthood would be the decision to stay or go when it was time for her to be college age. If she hadn't gone to school, she would have stayed in her family's house and probably worked as a secretary somewhere. But instead, she chose to leave, and her world got a lot bigger. She did have a sense of rebellion from her mother at this time because it was the first time that she could make up her own rules. And she did bring a Catholic home, uh, almost married him, even though her mother was really, really upset. There wasn't really anything she could do, and Joy continued doing what she wanted to do and enjoying her autonomy. Hindering factors to the resolution on the macro level being sexism that was inherent in society that put up a lot of roadblocks for her. The meso being the persecution of the cold region and just being shoved into tiny, tiny boxes in which she never truly fit. And the micro system being an only child in a tiny town. She did not have a lot of allies. And she knew that nothing was going to be handed to her, and she would have to make her dreams come true by herself. And she did. She was quite empowered at this time, I think, largely due to hearing about the feminist movement gaining some speed at this time. I think that gave her some strength to break the mold. She still had strong religious beliefs, but they were her beliefs now. They weren't being told to her. And she got to decide what she believed in. She's becoming super resilient after the childhood she had, and realizing that there's an inherent sense of equality there, even though it was never modeled to her growing up. She had strong convictions regardless. I'm looking at conflict theory here because conflict theories deal with inequality and oppression and have an emphasis on change. They reject the status quo and reframe system failures from the perspective of the victim rather than the oppressor, which is sort of revolutionary at this time. Louis Koser, in particular, was a conflict theorist, and he thought that conflict was just a part of human life. It was everywhere in society, and therefore it served some latent functions in society, and it could be a positive thing. He thought that social conflict could serve to align folks who were not in similar groups, but they had the same enemy, and therefore they joined together. It also was positive for communities when there was an external threat imposed on a system. It tended to make the in-group gain cohesion and identity and strength because they were focusing on attacking the enemy rather than attacking themselves. Many presidents that we know have realized this as well and have intentionally caused conflict with international countries in order to quiet the domestic concerns. Also, conflict can act as a pressure valve when there are some disputes or differences happening, it allows there to be some release there so that the conflict and the animosity doesn't continue forever and ever within a group, and it doesn't allow it to build up and build up and build up, because that's how wars get started. The thing that I found most interesting about Kozier's theory is that conflict is relational in nature, in that it helps define our identities based on the identity of the enemy, which I think is fascinating, because we can align ourselves with folks with completely different identities depending on the moment in history it is, and then 2 seconds later it could be a completely different story. And it's also particularly interesting to me that one's identity can be formed from knowing what they're not, rather than from knowing what they are. So they know that they're not part of their enemy's group or part of the minority. They know that they're part of the majority, and all they want to do is not become the minority. So therefore they begin to identify as a non-something. That's super interesting to me, and that's how identities get framed to begin with. He also believed that conflict could be positive or negative based on the assumptions that the group has. So a conflict over the dishwasher might not cause a divorce based on the expectations that the people in that marriage already have around the dishwasher. Same thing as far as adultery. Adultery might not break up a marriage if the folks in that marriage already had the expectation that they had an open relationship and therefore weren't surprised by this, versus if it were an monogamous couple having an affair and then got found out, it might very well break up the marriage because their expectations were that they would not be with anyone else. Another interesting point that he mentions in his research is the fact that for any group to exist, it has to exclude someone. In order to be in the majority, there has to be a minority, and therefore you have to kick someone out of the majority. They're in creating conflict in itself, in that there's always going to be an inclusion-exclusion process involving cultural norms or behavior regulation in terms of deciding what is acceptable and what is not as acceptable, and therefore that decides who's on the outs. Conflict theory and joy I just started looking at because there was so much conflict in her reality every day, on the world level and on smaller levels, like her own internal conflict between being Protestant or Catholic, or her family system's conflict over it, or the Cole region in general, and obviously the conflict in Vietnam was happening on a larger national scale at the same time as Joy was going through this life stage. Conflict did prove to be a catalyst for her, though, because it was a huge factor in the fact that she left town. She needed to leave town, and she became extremely independent and empowered because of that, which never would have happened if she didn't leave. Limitations of conflict theory is that it emphasizes polarization. It's a very black and white way of looking at the world, and it's based on assumption.